Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for Incite as we celebrate the finalists for the 2021 Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes. My name is Leah. I'm from the Vancouver Public Library's Programming and Learning team. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging that my home and the Vancouver Public Library are located on the traditional and unceded homelands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Tonight's event is part of Incite, Captivating Explorations of Books and Ideas, and this is a series presented in partnership between the Vancouver Writers Fest and the Vancouver Public Library. I'd like to take the opportunity to invite you to another upcoming library event. This Friday, April 16th, I hope you'll join us on Zoom for Black Oscars, What the Academy Awards Tell Us About Race. The Oscars are one of the most popular events on television, but critics and movements like #OscarsSoWhite have pointed out their complicated racial legacy. Professor Frederick W. Gooding Jr. will discuss his new book titled Black Oscars in conversation with Elamin Abdelmahmoud, host of CBC podcasts Pop Chat and Party Lines. More information about this and other events can be found at vpl.ca/events or by signing up for our email newsletter. And now please join me in a warm welcome as I pass things over to Leslie Hertig, Artistic Director of the Vancouver Writers Fest.
Thank you so much, Leah.
Thanks,
Good evening and welcome to this special Incite event featuring the 5 finalists for the BC and Yukon Book Prize's Jim Deva Award for Writing That Provokes. We're thrilled to have Billy Ray Belcourt, Joel Bakan, Amber Dawn, Michelle Good, and Benjamin Perrin all joining us on our virtual stage this evening. Great thanks to the BC and Yukon Book Prizes for their collaboration on this event. We are always glad to be celebrating homegrown authors and their remarkable books. A big thanks goes out once again to our Incite event partner, the Vancouver Public Library, for their collaboration and support. Thanks also to our government sponsors, the Government of Canada, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, the City of Vancouver, and CMHC Granville Island. This is our 7th Incite event of the season, and just a reminder that we host these events every other Wednesday between now and June, as well as some special events such as our digital book club. Tickets are now on sale for our Spring Book Club, featuring one of America's most highly regarded contemporary authors, Viet Thanh Nguyen, in conversation with Scotia Giller Prize-winning author Ian Williams. Viet's new book, The Committed, is a follow-up to his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, The Sympathizer, and is both a political literary thriller and a captivating novel of ideas. This event is going to take place on Sunday, May 16th, and tickets for that are on sale now from our website. And mark your calendars because our flagship festival will be returning in the 3rd week of October. I'm suspecting it might be a bit of a hybrid between some digital and some in-person events. Looking forward to that. Soon I'm going to turn things over to our host this evening. Megan will introduce our guests and invite them to talk with us about their new books and share a short reading. At the end, there will be some time for audience questions, so you can submit those via the YouTube channel, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Megan Cole this is her bio, a tattooed food enthusiast with an obsessive reading habit. She is the Director of Programming and Communications for the BC and Yukon Book Prizes. Part of the work that she does for the book prizes includes hosting and producing Writing the Coast, a podcast featuring interviews with the finalists and the winners of the BC and Yukon Book Prizes. When Megan isn't developing programming and podcast episodes, she's working on essays and her first creative nonfiction book, Head Over Feet, The Lasting Heartache of First Loves. Megan's work has appeared in The Puritan, Untethered Magazine, Coast Mountain Cultural Magazine, and more. Megan is joining us this evening from Powell River, BC. Please welcome Megan Cole.
Thanks so much, Leslie. I'm so honored to moderate this event on behalf of the BC and Yukon Book Prizes. As Leslie mentioned, I'm coming to you today from Powell River on the territory of the Klamath Nation. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to the Klamath Nation and to the many other Indigenous communities who have spent centuries stewarding these lands that we now call British Columbia. Thanks to the Vancouver Writers Festival and to the Vancouver Public Library for inviting the BC and Yukon Book Prizes to partner on this really exciting Incite featuring the finalists of the 2021 Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes. This is the second year for the Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes. The Jim Deva is generously supported by Bruce Smythe. Jim and Bruce opened Little Sisters Gay and Lesbian Bookstore and Art Emporium in 1983. Along with their staff and store managers, Jim and Bruce fought censorship and defended freedom of information. Books and magazines containing life-saving information in the middle of the AIDS crisis were prevented from crossing the border. But Jim, Bruce, and their store manager, Janine Fuller, fought back, eventually taking their case to the Supreme Court of Canada. Prior to opening the bookstore, Jim's love of literature made him want to be an English and drama teacher, but it was illegal at the time to be an openly gay teacher in Canada's public school system, and Jim was unapologetic about who he was. We are honored to be able to help continue Jim's legacy of upholding and safeguarding dignity and respect for all. The Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes is awarded to the author of an original work of published writing that challenges or provokes the ideas and forces that shape what writing, art, and/or society can become. This evening, we're going to hear from the authors of these 5 amazing books shortlisted for this exciting prize. As Leslie said, the writers are going to talk a little bit about their books and then read for us, and hopefully we'll have time for all of your questions at the end. Our first reader and presenter this evening is Joel Bakan. Joel teaches law at the University of British Columbia. His recent book and film, The New Corporation, are sequels to his critically acclaimed and widely translated best-selling book, The Corporation, and the award-winning documentary film it inspired. Joel's other work includes Childhood Under Siege, Just Words, and numerous scholarly works. Joel lives in Vancouver with his wife, Rebecca Jenkins. Joel's book, The New Corporation, How Good Corporations Are Bad for Democracy, is a finalist for the 2020 Jim Deva. Hi, Joel.
Hi, Megan. Thank you so much. And thank everybody and the BC and Yukon Book Prize, the Writers Festival, the Vancouver Public Library, an institution I love. Of course, Jim Deva, wherever you are. You were always a big inspiration, and it is truly an honor to be nominated for a prize in your name. As was mentioned, this is a sequel, this book, and there's a film as well. You can watch it on all those various corporate platforms out there that show films. Like the first one, I wrote the film and the book together. This time I directed the film with my co-director, Jennifer Abbott. And the idea for a sequel really came to me while I was sitting and watching the first film at the 10th anniversary of the release of that film and the book with it. And about halfway through the film, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I was thinking, here we are celebrating, right? We had champagne, we'd rented a theater, we were having a big party. And yet every single issue that we looked at in that first film had gotten worse. I mean, whether it was racial injustice or climate change, pollution, all of it had gotten worse. Corporations were bigger, they were more powerful. And I thought to myself, wow, what are we celebrating here? The first project was obviously an abject failure. If what we wanted to do was sort of help, contain or slay the dragon of corporate capitalism, well, the proof is in the pudding. We hadn't done a very good job of that. And so that got me thinking that maybe a sequel was necessary. And the other thing that got me thinking, the other thing that was happening is while the world was getting worse, and this was even before Donald Trump was elected, while the world was getting worse, corporations were saying that they were getting better. And this is the whole idea of good corporations or the new corporation movement. And without giving away too much of the story, the basic idea that I get at in the film is that there was a shift around 2005, around the time that the first film came out. And it was a shift that basically was away from the idea that social responsibility was just sort of a marketing strategy, and it was at the periphery of corporations. And corporations started saying, no, we're doing it differently now. We're baking it into our very missions. It's becoming our sort of central purpose to do good in the world. And what I show in the book, and the reason why I felt it was so urgent to tell this story, is that this isn't just public relations anymore, but it's really a play for complete power. It's really become the sort of idea that corporations now put forward to suggest they should have a much larger role in governing society, and democratic governments should have much lesser roles in governing society. So it's become sort of what people often refer to as neoliberalism with a smiling face, but the smiling face is very dangerous. And I liken it to the corporation, as I suggest in the first project. I diagnose it as a psychopath. In this project, I say basically the psychopath has found its charm, and it's become far more dangerous as a result. Now, in terms of reading, I only a minute ago sort of thought of what I want to read to you. We had finished the film, and I'd finished the book, and then George Floyd was brutally killed by police in Minneapolis. And we opened up the film. We felt we had to deal with this because it was very much directed connected to our central themes. So I just want to read to you the last pages of the book, which my publisher, thankfully, Penguin, allowed me, even though the thing had gone to the printer, allowed me to add. The fight to create a different and better world gains new urgency as citizens across the globe pour into the streets to protest racial injustice. Though ignited by the brutal police killing of George Floyd, these protests are about much more. Modern corporate capitalism is rooted in racist oppression and colonialism. Its rise reflected the prevailing idea at the time that non-whites are less than fully human. The same twisted logic advanced to justify slavery, genocidal policy, and land grabs from indigenous peoples, and slave-like conditions for workers in colonial territories. The great corporate fortunes of early capitalism, imperial companies like the Dutch East India Company and the Hudson's Bay Company, as well as slave traders, banks, and industrial empires, were forged from white supremacist beliefs and practices. The fact is, modern corporate capitalism was built on foundations of dehumanizingly racist doctrines and practices. In the United States and other places, for example, the original capital was provided by the labor of slaves, as Angela Davis notes. The Industrial Revolution, which pivoted around the production of capital, was enabled by slave labor, she continues. And the echoes of that past and colonialism more generally reverberate even louder today. The same racialized groups who not so long ago were enslaved, dispossessed, and brutally exploited, including African Americans in the US, now are overrepresented among the underpaid and underemployed, more likely to be threatened and unsafe in their lives and work, poor, less healthy, ill-housed, deprived of basic necessities, exploited by multinational corporations seeking cheap and exploitable labor, and toiling as migrant workers in slave-like conditions. They're over-incarcerated, over-policed, and criminalized, too often slain by police and military, inordinately made ill and killed by industrial and workplace pollution, most vulnerable to the ravages of climate change. Indigenous people around the world suffer from all that, as well as being evicted from their territories to make way for extractive projects that waste their lands. Most new corporations have joined in to the Black Lives Matter movement, protesting the recent police killing of George Floyd and others, proclaiming solidarity with protesters and social movements. And while their leaders' avowals and promises to help are likely sincere, the fact remains that corporations can only do such good as will help them do well, a profound limit on how much good they can do, and even worse, an obfuscation of their predilection to do bad, to, in this case, promote racial injustice. Just look at what corporations do. They campaign for cuts to taxes, regulation, and spending, and thus undermine policies designed to foster racial equality, human rights protections, anti-poverty programs, workers' rights, job and income security, social services, and so on. They lobby for laws that facilitate exploitation of migrant workers. They push for mega projects that dispossess Indigenous peoples and destroy their lands and ways of life. And continue with all of that. And through their actions, new corporations foster new forms of colonialism, ones that converge synergistically with old forms of racism. Today's protests are challenging that and the broader dynamics of injustice informing it. They're puncturing myths and seeking change. This is America's moment of reckoning, as the Harvard University professor and commentator Dr. Cornel West describes it. The catalyst was certainly Brother George Floyd's public lynching, but the broader context is the failure of the predatory capitalist economy to provide the satisfaction of the basic needs of food and healthcare and quality education, jobs with a decent wage. It's a system obsessed with money, 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 domination of workers, marginalization of those who don't fit in. Now, I just want to finish with a great quote that I love from Dr. Cornel West. He says, and he's talking about the protests, all of this rebellious energy, it's got to be channeled through organizations rooted in a quest for truth and justice. Rebellion is not the same thing as revolution. What we need is a nonviolent revolutionary project of full-scale democratic sharing, power, wealth, resources, respect, organizing, and fundamental transformation. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Joel. Our next reader this evening is Billy Ray Belcourt. Billy Ray is a writer and scholar from the Driftpile Cree Nation. He won the 2018 Griffin Poetry Prize for his debut collection, This Wound is a World, which was also a finalist for the Governor General's Literary Award. His second book of poetry, Indian Coping Mechanisms, Notes from the Field, was longlisted for Canada Rees 2020. A recipient of the prestigious Rhodes Scholarship and an Inspire Award, Billy Ray is an assistant professor of Indigenous creative writing at UBC. Billy Ray's memoir, A History of My Brief Body, is a finalist for the 2021 Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes, as well as the 2021 Hubert Evans Nonfiction Prize. Welcome, Billy Ray.
Thank you so much, Megan. It is a deep honor to be here with Vancouver Writers Festival, and given the circumstances, this important award. I'm from the Driftpile Cree Nation in Northwest Alberta and Treaty 8 territory. I'm here in Vancouver on the unceded ancestral lands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh. My book, A History of My Brief Body, is an examination of the life of someone who lives at the intersections of queerness and indigeneity. Begins with my childhood in Northern Alberta, the ontological particularities of being from a place where queerness is mostly an abstraction, where racism governs everyday life, to my time in Edmonton throughout my early 20s as someone stepping into his queer indigeneity and the various tribulations that unfold. I'm going to read a few prose poems, essentially. So here goes. Indian writer bemoans the red condition, which is that wherever he goes, he posits his queerness as a metaphysical conundrum. With each lispy word, modern history aggregates inside him like a wasp colony. Everywhere, he is met by rows and rows of Michel Foucaults who promise he is freer than he thinks. Andean writer chuckles to himself now and then about the idiosyncrasy of this. Andean writer is reminded of Judith Butler, who in Gender Trouble ruminates on what she calls the sentimental Foucault. The Foucault who, despite his paranoid habits of diagnosis and disavowal, sometimes paused and stood beside himself to nod to a less disciplinary elsewhere. Legendarily, Foucault seldom spoke about himself. He and Andean writer don't have this in common. But Andean writer does suspect that Foucault's sentimentality had everything to do with something he has already written down in another poem. No one runs to theory unless there is a dirt road in him. Andean writer is hard at work on the paradox that one can be born into a past and at the same time indecipherable to it. That is his job, to keep watch of paradox. Andean writer knows that this isn't a new undertaking. To be unoriginal might have humiliated Andean writer a few years ago, but it doesn't matter because today he is in a boat with a bunch of Foucaults, minutes away from an island where the only universal is that there are no bodies to bury, and thus no longer a need to make shovels out of our heavy hands. Until today, I railed against the grisly fate reserved for men like me. I'm an anachronism in the way that all queer men are anachronisms, far too early. I'm a poet in the way that all queer men are poets, not a novel thought likely. Ours is the audacity of begging for what Maggie Nelson called a compassionate wilderness. Jose Esteban Munoz says, the queer citizen subject labors to live in a present that is calibrated to sacrifice our liveness. I don't need a record of my here-ness. What I do need is to take ecstasy with Jose Esteban Munoz. Paradise is wherever he is. Until then, I will try to be a pretty wound at least once. Confession, I'm not yet comfortable taking my shirt off in a poem. Subjectivity abuses, subjectivity rescues. Men shoved my head into the clouds. I missed so much. There is humiliation in this dystopia too. Here, my words appear in the air upside down. My mouth is a dirty floor. I'm sweeping up the dirt with my imagination. July 2017. Fixed in the pale light of an overhead lamp, sprawled across my mattress on the floor. You are so motionless, it looks as though you're a painting ruled by sentiment. I hope you're capable of such grace so that I too can be. We, two men of no aesthetic significance, engineered beauty from stolen time with our lumbering bodies. All my psyche can hold is the past, present, and future tense of the moment. I lie down beside you, the sheets rustling beneath us as though we've made a forest floor of our yearnings. I want to live a whole human life in this bedroom of wet hands, where, for evenings at a time, the world starts and ends without celebration or remorse. What I know, we aren't running away. The eyes are too hungry for their own good. There is yellow of endless gradations. I want to see you tiptoe into all of them. Beside you, bound together in the same puny blaze, there is little to believe in besides the promise of our infinite luminosity. Dozing off, it occurs to me that if there is a corrective to the problem of my existential loneliness, it is this study of light. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Billy Ray. Before I introduce our next reader, I just want to remind everyone that if you have any questions for our finalists this evening, be sure to put those into YouTube and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. Our next reader this evening is Amber Dawn. Amber Dawn is the author of 5 books, including How Poetry Saved My Life, a Hustler's Memoir, Where the Words End and My Body Begins, and Sodom Road Exit. She is also the editor of 3 anthologies. Amber Dawn currently teaches creative writing at Douglas College, as well as guest mentors at several community-driven spaces by and for sex workers. Amber Dawn's book, My Art is Killing Me and Other Poems, is a finalist for the 2021 Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes. Welcome, Amber Dawn.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here. Normally, when I'm invited to read, I spend a fair bit of time trying to figure out how much I should temper or qualify the more explicit aspects of my writing to suit any particular audience. In fact, I often scan my books for the quote unquote lightest passages to read. But Jim Deva would want us to voice our expansive truths and bold imaginations. Jim Deva, who has taught me many lessons, would want us, in fact, to raise hell. So I'm gonna go for it and dive right in. Let me start by telling you about a Twitter meme I saw a while back. It read, "Are you a Pornhub category or do you have privilege?" Pornhub, of course, being a streaming pornographic website, offers categorical channels such as lesbian, ebony, transgender, Asian, etc., that porn consumers can subscribe specifically to. So riffing from this tweet, other people tweeted responses. And these responses spanned from, "Are you a banned hashtag or do you have privilege?" to, "Are there multiple laws that regulate your existence or do you have privilege? Are you being debated in an institutional room that you've never been invited into or do you have privilege? Are your stories being falsely told by power-holding outsiders or do you have privilege?" I tweeted that last one myself. And these tweets rather sum up the credo behind my writing for My Art is Killing Me and Other Poems. After a decade of being a visible white, queer, disabled sex worker writer, I have a lot of anecdotal evidence that telling our stories within what we call Canadian literatures can be very risky. I offer this as an introduction to my book. The poems within investigate the toll art making takes on artists. There's themes of sexual and cultural harassment, surviving violence, tokenism, social media burnout, etc. I thank Billy Ray, Michelle, Benjamin, and Joel for your profound emotional intelligence and your willingness to continue to take artistic risk, especially within a national arts sector that too often does not privilege you. It's such an honor to be nominated alongside of you, and rest in power, Jim Deva. The poems in my collection are long and rather essaic, so I'm just going to read a short passage from a poem called How Hard Feels. Through a filmy single-pane window, I see one of my TAs cross the campus lawn. Early morning, she cuts a path in the damp grass. All I've learned about her so far is that she cares deeply for the needed weave of coastal biodiversity, and that she loves old movies. The tenured professor sprints behind, briefcase, camel coat. I can't hear the words he calls out, only that she stops when his mouth moves. He reaches for her shoulder. Do I see circular touch, hair sweep, finger dance, mere seconds, trap flash. They fall out of the window's frame before I can lift myself from my desk. Everywhere there is a man. It is exaggeration to call the desk mine. It's a satellite desk, a workspace shared by adjunct instructors in the creative writing program at the University of British Columbia. Still, I've asserted myself by pinning 2 personal portraits to the shared corkboard. The first portrait, a national newspaper interview for which, against my better judgment, I posed beside a chain link fence alongside a track I call Blowjob Alley for the photograph. The headline reads, "Sex trade worker turns poet and gives back with a frank memoir. Everywhere there is a man." The second, pen and ink illustration of my head with the body of a mermaid, drawn by an undergrad on the last day of my poetry workshop. Around the me mermaid, bull kelp and eelgrass spins into the words, "Speak your truth." Speak your truth is how I sign my memoir whenever I'm asked for an autograph. Years before, the tenured professor reaches for my thigh under a long formica table while my short stories about pig farms is being discussed in his class. Everywhere there is a man. Again, my thigh in his office, circular touch, right hand blur between counselor and Lech as he tells me, "I know it's hard, but push, push, push yourself. You can write, yes, talent, if you push, push, push yourself, I can see you going all the way." Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man who knows it's hard, a man with an office door. Everywhere there is a man, he spoons wise guidance, so familiar with what ought to be said and when. Everywhere there is a man with a running tab at the bar, with a car parked right outside. Everywhere there is a man who waxes past or future favor. He will make introductions if he can. Everywhere there is a man with an agent who might just be looking for new voices. Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man. I began my memoir at university. I thought if I was going to break the book world, it would be by writing an outsider's memoir. Then Sheila went missing, and Shelby was found dead in a shopping cart behind a laundromat. And I turned decidedly to fiction. Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man who knows it's hard, who remembers being a nobody himself back when, humble start. Don't say he was handed a damn thing. Everywhere there was a man who's rolled up his sleeves, pulled socks, cut teeth, tooth and nail, hammer in the anvil, knows the grindstone, made headway, measured that extra mile. Everywhere there is a man so red hot for taxonomy, for hashtags, not all men. Pud-whacking hot for the adage, my sword is my pen. Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man. Everywhere there is a man. Thank you so much. I'll leave that there. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Amber Dawn. I feel like I need a minute with that reading. And thank you for helping us raise hell this evening. I feel like that's what we're here for, and it's so much fun to be in your words. It's so great. Thank you to the 5 of you. And speaking of the 5 of you, next up is Michelle Good. Michelle is a Cree writer and a member of the Red Pheasant Cree Nation in Saskatchewan. After working for Indigenous organizations for 25 years and advocating for residential school survivors, she obtained a law degree. She earned her MFA in creative writing at UBC while still practicing law. Her first novel, 5 Little Indians, was nominated for the Giller Prize and was a finalist for the Writers' Trust Prize. Her poems, short stories, and essays have been published in magazines and anthologies across Canada. Michelle now lives in BC's southern interior. 5 Little Indians is a finalist, of course, for the Jim Deva Prize for Writing That Provokes, as well as the 2021 Ethel Wilson Fiction Prize. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you for having me today. It's a real pleasure. I really appreciate it. And I am quite honored to be among this esteemed company, some very brilliant people sitting here, and I'm very thankful to be here. I did get my law degree at UBC. That was 25 years ago, Joel. You were there at the time. It was a different law school, that's for sure. And but I had been working with issues relating to residential schools even before that. And then subsequently, I was representing survivors for about 14, 15 years. And one of the things that I've been hearing since I was a teenager really is, why can't they just get over it? Why can't survivors, why can't the Indigenous community just get over this and move on? And while there is, a tremendous amount of work that's been done in the Academy in terms of the impacts of residential school, the psychological impacts, the sociological, political impacts, the relationship of it to colonialism and so on, there has been little change, much like Joel's observation with respect to, the first corporation and then the new corporation, all these years, and still nothing has changed really. And so this book, and I think specifically about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and what a magnificent document it is, so thorough, complete, and writing from inside the Indigenous community. But I wonder how many people have actually read that beyond the calls to action. And so I've been threatening to write a book about all of this for a long time. And ultimately, I decided to write this as a story, as a fiction, as a piece of fiction, because I felt that it was more consistent with the way we learn in a traditional Indigenous community. Storytelling in the context of oral tradition is the way we teach and the way we learn. I also felt that it was a safe place for people to walk into a story, because they can always say, oh, it's just fiction, until they get in there and it sort of grabs them and they realize it's fiction, but it's also true. So I've been really humbled by the response that this book has received, both critically and in terms of reader comments that I get. People track me down, and it's very moving and very humbling. So with that, I'm going to just read a short portion from one of the characters, Maisie. And one of the things that I really wanted to communicate about through this book is how it wasn't just the children, it wasn't just the people who went to residential school who were harmed by it, but it was their communities, their families, their children subsequently. And so this is one of and about how she tried to go home. When they let me out of the mission school, Sister traveled with me all the way to Vancouver and put me on a boat that was supposed to take me home. There were seven of us girls from the mission school and another 12 boys and girls from other Indian schools who joined up with us to catch the boat and head back up north to our coastal village. 10 years had passed since they dragged me away from my mom, kicking and screaming, and it was the last time I'd seen her or my dad. When we got to our village, tired, cold, and hungry, we were herded off the boat in single file. Standing on the beach at the end of the dock were a group of men and women, milling around and looking to the dock as we walked toward them. For a moment, the two groups just stood there, kids on the dock, parents on the sand. Then a boy from one of the other schools broke and ran, calling out for his dad. The rest of us ran too, right into that crowd of grown-ups who were supposed to be our parents. We were all pretty much as tall as them now, and everyone was looking at everyone else, looking for something familiar, something to recognize. I didn't know what to do, so I just stood there, hoping one of them was my mom and that she would recognize me. I couldn't pick her out in the crowd. A woman approached me, gently asked if I was Sally. No, not me. Finally, I noticed a woman, her hair wrapped tight in a pale blue scarf, standing at the edge of the group, looking straight at me. I knew it was my mom. Arms open, she ran for me, crying. My mom took me home and gave me tasty things to eat. My dad was out fishing, she said, but would be back in the morning. She said they weren't really sure I would be there that day. The house was smaller than in my memory, but familiar. And the whole evening, I just wanted to cry as I took it all in, the place I'd been dreaming about for 10 years. My dad came home the next morning and held me so tight. He smelt of wood smoke and fish, and that primal smell tumbled me back in time to a thin memory of me and my mom meeting him at the dock, him tossing me in the air, me laughing so hard my belly hurt. He would carry me home like I weighed nothing, my face in the crook of his neck, rough sea salt rubbing off my face. They told me that after I was taken, no one told them where I was. They still didn't know which school I'd been sent to. I couldn't help but wonder if they'd tried to find out. They must have, but the angry question kept rising in me anyway, and their constant affection began to disgust me. I lasted a month. No matter how hard I tried, this place, their house, was no longer home, and these people, though kind and loving, were like strangers pretending to be family. I hitched a ride on a trawler to Prince Rupert and took a bus to Vancouver with the $100 my dad pressed into my hand as my mother stood by crying. Not so long ago, I was at the Balmoral and met a girl from up there. After the expected ritual sharing of who your aunties and uncles are, she told me she was sorry about my mom. I didn't know, but she didn't need to say more. I had so many dreams at the Indian school about going home to her, dreams about sleeping safe in my own room, playing on the beach at ease and without fear, and cooking with her. What I so desperately needed was to be standing on that stool by the stove, carefully stirring under her watchful eye, like when I was little, to be little again, living without fear and brutality. No one gets that back. All that's left is a craving, insatiable, empty place.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I'm sure glad you made good on that threat to write a book.
Thank you.
Last but not least, Benjamin Perrin is a professor at the University of British Columbia, Peter A. Allard School of Law, and author of Overdose, Heartbreak and Hope in Canada's Opioid Crisis. Ben served as a law clerk at the Supreme Court of Canada and was lead justice and public safety advisor to the Prime Minister. Overdose is a finalist for the Jim Deva, as well as the 2021 Hubert Evans Nonfiction Prize. Hi, Ben.
Hi, Megan. Thanks so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It is a real pleasure to be here. I also, in my home in Vancouver, in the traditional ancestral and unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. The other thing that I want to just begin by acknowledging is today, April 14th, is the 5-year anniversary, as many of you would have seen in the media, and for some of you, much more deeply touched by this being the 5-year anniversary of the declaration of a public health emergency in British Columbia for the opioid crisis. It is a public health emergency which has never been worse. We are continuing to shatter new records as the restrictions for COVID-19 have basically had us do the exact opposite of what we were telling people to do until COVID hit. The opioid crisis encouraged people to not use alone, to come together, to go to places like overdose prevention sites. And of course, all that changed just over a year ago. And so the startling reality is that over 7,000 British Columbians have died over the last 5 years. When I began the research for this book, Overdose, it was right around that time when the public health emergency had been declared, and I started hearing story after story as I was driving home to and from my job at UBC, hearing about another person overdosing and dying, another person the next day. And I had worked in the area of criminal law, done criminal law policy at the sort of highest levels of government, and yet had this nagging concern. Like, obviously the system wasn't working. That was totally clear to me. What bothered me is that I just kept going about my day. Listen to a story and just keep driving. And this point in my life, I had really started to, I think, open my eyes a bit more to just the reality of my own life, my own inadequacies, failings, even, and starting to see people differently. And I, during that time, it also started to rediscover in a really concrete and direct way my own faith, which up until that point had been really something that I had gone very, very far from. And so I did something you won't hear many people say, and this is a night for provocation. So I actually pulled the car over, and I prayed. I prayed to God. I said, "Can give me a heart of compassion for people who are dying of this crisis," because I didn't have that at that point. It was statistics, it was numbers, and I didn't know anyone at that point who had died from illicit drug overdoses. A lot of people assume that, how could you go from being Stephen Harper's justice advisor one minute and then like calling for decriminalizing drugs and safe supply the next? And they assume it's because I had a family member or someone close to me die, or that I'm a opioid user or something like that. Nothing could be further from the truth in terms of those things. It was only after the book was written that I actually had two people who I know who passed away through the opioid crisis. So Overdose is the journey of me having a complete change of mind and a change of heart. And it takes readers who, like me, it is written for people who have not yet come to support those policies. And so the book is structured around that journey. It literally takes people inside the overdose prevention sites here in Vancouver and elsewhere. It goes into undercover, police drug units. And I frankly got on the record police officers saying, like, this is not working. Judges who said, the people who are showing up before my court, the life stories of them who are here now on drug charges began in many instances tragically. The most tragic story I ever heard during this process that for me was a real turning point in how I saw people who used drugs was as I began to understand the impacts of a lifetime of trauma that many people have experienced that brought them to that place. And a judge who sits here in Vancouver in the downtown east side recounted not one, but two men who are now, quite a bit older, obviously, but their journey began as young children, as toddlers, who literally witnessed their mothers being murdered in front of them, and they were left with the body for days. And this is the kind of childhood trauma that they have, because of our, completely inadequate system, mental health system, they have self-medicated with. And fentanyl, which is the drug that is largely directly responsible for all these deaths, is a drug which was created in a lab to specifically alleviate pain for people who are in palliative care and dying. And that's how it's being used today. And so, yeah, I encourage you to check Overdose out. And it certainly is a real humbling thing to have seen the response that it's gotten. I tried to make the point tonight that a book like this should not win a prize for writing that provokes. And the reason for that being the policies that we are pursuing are so bad and so horrible that a book calling them out should not be considered provocative, right? It shouldn't be considered provocative to say that we should decriminalize drugs. It should not be provocative to say that we should provide a safe supply. It shouldn't be provocative to say that we should provide, safe places for people to use drugs, and that we should replace, over a century of a failed racist colonial experience with prohibition, with something that is based on evidence and compassion. That should not be provocative to say that our public policy should be designed to save lives and follow the best medical evidence. And yet here we are. And those ideas are still so provocative that provincial conservative governments run and win elections on them and raise money off them, as well as the federal Conservative Party. And even the governing Liberal Party is too politically terrified of legalizing drugs to do so. Or decriminalizing, rather, hard drugs, so-called hard drugs, to do so. And that's not just a sort of opinion statement that's based on me having, conversations and interviewing people, and including private conversations with 2 cabinet ministers who sat at the cabinet table with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and have said to me, the reason is not lack of evidence. You've got everyone from, the Premier of British Columbia now, the Mayor of Vancouver, the Chief Medical Officer, Bonnie Henry, the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, and someone like me, who is the former top criminal justice advisor to Stephen Harper, all saying we need to do this. So these ideas shouldn't be provocative, and yet they still are. So we have a long way to go. I'm going to read. I like Joel's lead of reading the end of the book. It's not a spoiler, but it's definitely also, for me, I think, kind of part of the more provocative pieces to it, where I do go back at the very end to that journey that began with that prayer. And so I think it's a good kind of bookend here. How does the opioid crisis end? Unless we do something radically different to stem the tide, the realistic worst case scenario is that overdose death rates decline because there are fewer and fewer people who use drugs left alive month after month, year after year. In that catastrophic scenario, illicit opioid use eventually abates by raw attrition, crisis averted, and we all go back to our regularly scheduled programming, except for the tens of thousands of friends, family, and loved ones left behind. That's what I fear will happen if apathy and numb acceptance of massive overdose death rates become the new normal, and if prejudice, ignorance, and crass political considerations prevail over research, evidence, and a heart of compassion for people affected by this unnatural disaster. In the midst of the despair, destruction, and death that has characterized the opioid crisis, is there any hope? This was the final unanswered question I had, and it was the one that almost everyone who read this manuscript of this book had. So beyond the public health interventions, the latest pharmaceutical treatments, social programs, legal reforms, could this crisis abate? And even if we're able to keep people alive, is there any hope that people can be ultimately freed from the chains of addiction? Addiction doesn't occur in needles, spoons, lighters, bottles. Addiction occurs in the brain, said Marshall Smith, Senior Advisor for Recovery Initiatives at the BC Centre on Substance Use. And no matter what the substance is that people are using out there, this is a people problem. This is a crisis of community. It's a crisis of connection. It's a crisis that's occurring in people, in families, in workplaces. We like to simplify that and say that it's an opiate problem and point the finger at the drug as if it's the bad thing. And that's just not the case. Having hope for a better future is vital in overcoming despair. Indeed, without hope, people perish. Alone and without hope, people are continuing to die in large numbers during this epidemic. But there's no prescription for hope. It doesn't come in a pill. You can't manufacture it. You know what gets you through? Number one is the community. It's just having support. The second is faith, said Bill Mullard, president of Union Gospel Mission. When you talk to most of the people on the streets, they all have faith. And how could you? How could you live on the street and not? So there's a faith component there. People are saying, I need something to believe in that's on my side and willing to help me. And then they look and they begin to find it. Finding hope through faith resonated with me, but I wanted to know, was there any research that would back up what Mullard was saying about his own experience working in Vancouver's downtown east side? Dr. Alexandra Ledette, the director of the Center for the Study of Addictions and Recovery in New York, has investigated the role of faith in the struggle against addiction. She says, human beings have long looked to faith for strength and support, particularly in difficult times. And scientific research and clinical practice were slow to acknowledge and investigate the role this had in our human experience. She notes that decades of research have shown over 200 studies demonstrating the positive role that faith plays in mental health and well-being. It's been found to support greater emotional well-being, improve coping for people, and there's an increasing role that it plays in the understanding of addressing addiction. This is a quote from, I'll just skip ahead a little bit here. Dr. Adet says, many substance users often come into recovery feeling abandoned by God or alienated from God or from a religious community. And yet a new life is possible. Being in recovery has changed the way I see God. I came into recovery with a God, but it was a punishing, vengeful, and unforgiving God. I had done so many things I knew were ungodly that I thought for sure I was going to hell, said Craig, a 44-year-old in recovery. When I came into recovery, I found a new God. I found a God that was loving, forgiving, understanding, and responsive to the needs I have. in retrospect, I can see that God has been with me all the time. A study of 14 countries, including Canada, by the World Health Organization, found that people with drug addictions have the highest level of social disapproval or stigma of any class of individuals, worse even than those with leprosy. That gave me real pause, as I remembered back to why I started looking into the opioid crisis in the first place. A prayer to God for a heart of compassion for the people affected by it. The same Jesus who I follow laid his hands on people with leprosy when no one else would go near them. Are more professing Christians willing to similarly love and care for people who use drugs rather than judge and condemn them? A diverse coalition, including people who use drugs, families and friends affected by the opioid crisis, health and medical practitioners, Indigenous communities, human rights advocates, liberals, progressives, fiscal conservatives, libertarians, and people of faith need to be part of a major societal shift in how we think about and deal with substance use. Each of us is on our own unique journey in life, but we're not alone. It's being increasingly acknowledged that the opposite of addiction is connection. And when important relationships in our life are disrupted or never fully develop, it causes pain and suffering. It makes it more difficult to cope with all the stress, challenges, and trauma of this world. Substances and unhealthy behaviors appear to soothe that pain temporarily, but ultimately are self-destructive. That path leads to isolation, shame, and despair. Our society often makes it worse by heaping judgment and blame on top of that brokenness. The other path is totally different. It's one of connection, love, and hope. The first path leads to death, and the other to life. Here's the last paragraph. Many of the courageous people who are leading the effort to address the opioid crisis and whom I got to know through this book are themselves in recovery from substance use disorders. Today, they're leading recovery centers, running safe consumption sites, and acting as powerful agents for change. They're living full and satisfying lives, and each of them, in their own way, has found hope and is living free from the chains of addiction. And what's most remarkable is they're now supporting others in their journey of recovery. They're sharing the love that was poured into their lives in order to help others who can hardly dare to imagine one day being free. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. So we do have some questions here from the audience. So I'm going to invite our authors our finalists to turn their videos back on, because these are kind of aimed at all of you. So we'll do our best to get answers from all five. Ariel's question is, as authors nominated for powerful works which have provoked thought and change for others, can you all share something that has provoked you as readers? And maybe, Ben, if I can put you on the spot, because you went last, maybe I'll throw you in first here.
Yeah, let me think about that. That is a good question. I mean, to be quite honest with you, this is the whole point of our meeting today, is everyone has shared very frankly and openly from their heart, which I really greatly appreciated. The most provocative I've ever read as an adult is actually the Bible. And I was, kind of raised going to church, like I mentioned, heard all the stories, and was sort of, the model was, oh, here's all these people, you're supposed to kind of be like them, so even someone like, Noah, who's a good guy, God said, build an ark, go build it, and you survive the flood. Well, as an adult, reading that, one of the first things Noah does, of course, after that is gets drunk, and he's found naked in the tent by his sons. That didn't make it into the Sunday school lesson. Okay. It reveals people who are broken. And I have to say, my reading of the entire Bible completely changed after I started looking at it as an adult. So that's really changed my mind. And quite frankly, there was a meme going around, it's been going on for a long time, but it was comparing like the colonial Jesus with the historic Jesus. Some of you have seen this. And I think that there are some incredibly provocative things which Jesus stood for, which I found really challenged me. I was a judgmental person. I was judging people. I was condemning them. I thought I was better than them. And I'm glad that I don't feel that way anymore, because that was so wrong, and the rank hypocrisy there. And so, yeah, so that's my provocative answer. It's the most widely read book in the world, by the way, and they took it off the bestsellers list because of that. There's like 6 billion copies sold. So if you haven't read it, there's a book you should read.
Thanks, Ben. How about you, Michelle? Something that has provoked you as a reader?
Everything provokes me. I think I was thinking about two things. One was I was just a little kid. I was in grade 6, and we got to choose a book to do a book report, and I did a book report on Rachel Carson's Silent Spring about the destruction of the environment. And that book was it scared the hell out of me. I was a little kid, and I realized when I was a little kid that there are forces in the world that care more about money than they do about life. And that freaked me right out and really set me on a course in my life. The second book, also read as a very young person, was Maria Campbell's Half-Breed, because I'm obviously a half-breed. My mother is Cree, my father is French and English. And about, how she incorporated in that book so much in terms of the historical realities of Métis people. I'm not Métis, I'm mixed blood. And it also led me on a real journey of inquiry, because of course my mother was, they say enfranchised, I say disenfranchised, when she married a non-Indigenous man. And so I grew up in non-Indigenous Canada. So both of those books provoked me in a way that really sort of set me on a path of looking beneath the surface, not accepting the obvious as truth.
Thanks. Joel, do you want to weigh in on this one?
Sure. Yeah. The opening page of Leo Tolstoy's novel, his last novel, Resurrection, which he wrote in 1899, which really picks up on themes that both Ben and Michelle have already talked about. No matter that men in the hundreds of thousands disfigured the land on which they swarmed, paved the ground with stones so that no green things could grow, filled the air with fumes of coal and gas, lopped back all the trees, and drove away every animal and every bird, spring was still spring. And to me, that's just, that's 1899, and he's talking about, and he goes on and talks about the ravages of people searching for money, not for the beauty which inclines the heart to peace and love and concord, but their own devices for wielding power over their fellow men. And so he creates this sort of critique of capitalism and how it's destroying nature and how it's destroying community. But still, spring is still spring. And that's where the hope lies. And that's where our fight has to be, to ensure that it is. And so I found that whole novel incredibly inspiring. And it is, picking up on Ben's point, it's about faith, ultimately. But a stunning critique as well of the sort of capitalist dynamics that Tolstoy saw emerging at the time.
It's interesting how a few of the books mentioned are some oldies but goodies, ones that just linger with us no matter how much time has passed. Amber, Dawn, do you want to answer this question?
Sure. I'm just enwrapped by everyone else's answers. But when I moved to Vancouver, it was the same year that Little Sisters bookstore had been bombed for the 3rd time. Jim Deva and his team really did some great acts of service, keeping Little Sisters open throughout the year. And you mentioned Little Sisters versus Canada, which was about the right to bring queer and trans books into Canada across the US border. And one of the books that kept getting stopped at the border, like there must have been some kind of flag on it, was Patrick Cliffia's Macho Sluts. It was published in 1998, so still very much during the AIDS pandemic. And we wanted this book. Like it was, because we couldn't get it, it became almost this like holy grail type of book. And I remember, someone within my inner circle finally got a copy of Macho Sluts, and we sat around a kitchen table and we take turns reading a passage to each other. And that just opened up a whole world for me, like Christos, who an Indigenous lesbian poet who's also had books censored and banned, Sapphire, who famously wrote Precious, which was adopted into film. Also a wonderful poet. Much of her work was banned. Larissa Lai, Kate Borenstein. So Little Sisters really, Little Sisters is like my point of inspiration that introduced me. It was the front door to this beautiful, exquisite house of queer and trans literature.
Thanks, Amber Dawn. Billy Ray, something that provoked you as a reader?
Yeah, I think I'm looking at some of the books that are very haphazardly stacked on my desk, just outside the frame. There's French writer Hervé Guibert, excuse my pronunciation, a writer who died in his 30s due to complications because of AIDS, and who nonetheless had written a huge body of literature, and all of it, what I read sort of is so alive and so desperate and so sexy and so beautiful, and there's a lot to be found in those books. I think also two of my dear friends who also are poets, Jay Simpson and Ariel Twist, trans Indigenous writers, who are really opening up a discussion that has not been opened up yet, especially in the public sphere. So I learn a lot and admire them very deeply.
Thanks, Billy Ray. I feel like I should have had a pen to scribble down all of the books you were saying. I'll have to watch it again on YouTube. We have a second question here from Rob Bittner. Rob asks, what does the word provoke mean to you, especially since the award jury feels that all your books manage to be provocative in some way? Shall I pick someone to go first?
I'll go first.
Okay, thanks, Michelle.
To me, I think, when we speak of provocative writing, I think what it means is writing, or to me, what it means is writing that inspires people to think outside of the parameters that they may have been stuck within before. Something that challenges you to think of the world in a different way, to think of, for example, people that are suffering from addictions, to think of them in a different way, to think of, the capitalist structure, not as a benevolent father, but something just to think of in the survivors as people who have, against all odds, survived one of the key implements in the colonial toolkit. And so I think that thing about writing that moves you outside, pushes you, provokes you, like with a sharp stick outside of your comfort zone, to me, that's provocative writing.
I concur.
And a thumbs up from Ben. How about you, Amber Dawn? What do you think of the word provoke?
I really love what Michelle's just introduced here. The idea that provocative work sort of encourages the reader to think outside of what their immediate worldview is, and often that goes hand in hand with challenging our own comfort zones. I think that's a great definition. provoke can be an antagonistic word. Sometimes we can be a little bit nervous around the word provoke because it feels so forceful, right? And, of course, we're all about consent, and we want to have, as nurturing as a relationship as we can with our readers. But I really love to embrace the provocateur in me. And I guess to add something perhaps to Michelle's a very eloquent articulation of what does provocative mean. Sometimes I think provocative can also mean that you can tap something in a reader that maybe they haven't allowed themselves to voice yet or to think about. Like, I really hope that I, in some ways, provoke other readers who have had similar worldview or similar experience to me, to get closer to themselves. That might be a bit of a lofty goal for an author to have with a reader, but it is something that I hope for. That I can provoke people closer to who they are.
Thanks. Billy Ray, do you want to weigh in on this one before we go to our last question?
I think everything's been covered.
Sounds good. Our last question then comes from Kylie. All the authors have talked about paradox or contradiction in their works. The world is falling apart, but corporations are doing well. The inheritance of past and being a stranger to it, to speaking your expansive truth and yet coming up against the constraints of men, of speaking truth through fiction. What do you find as the core paradox of the writing you're exploring? Ben?
Yeah, that is a great question. I love these questions. They're so good. The core paradox that I explore in Overdose is the idea that trying to suppress things that are harmful is actually ultimately makes them worse. So it's essentially the law of unintended consequences. That is the biggest paradox that we see in the use of the criminal law to attempt to shape or mold society in some way has been a complete and total failure. And I didn't have a chance tonight to unpack and talk more about the devastating impacts on Indigenous peoples in British Columbia, but I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in terms of the criminal justice system more broadly, but the opioid crisis specifically. And so the paradox is that rather we've been going about this completely the wrong way. Right? We've been threatening and punishing and criminalizing people when we needed to be treating them with compassion and respect all along. So it is a devastating paradox that has cost thousands and thousands of lives.
Thanks, Ben.
I can jump in.
Sure.
My book is all about a paradox on the surface of corporations presenting themselves as good and socially responsible and nice and benevolent when in fact they're not. But there's a much deeper paradox in the book, and that is less on the surface and more structured into the entirety of it. And that is that we as human beings are very complex mixes of self-interest, of compassion, of beauty, of meanness sometimes, of desire to consume nice things, but also of selfless devotion to others and relationship. And so we're this incredibly complex mix. And yet in corporate capitalism, we've created a dominant system that amplifies, draws upon, and reflects, and then sort of imposes a very narrow conception of who we are, the sort of laissez-faire man, as it was described in the late 19th century. But this idea of ourselves as sort of rational, self-interested maximizers of our own welfare and wealth, islands within picket fences that have to be protected from each other, a very sort of non-relational and very sad, selfish and self-interested conception of who we are. And then we create institutions, namely the corporation, that are imbued with that character and with that personality, and that become power wielders in the name of those values. So it's that paradox between who we really are and the institutional structures that we create for ourselves that I think really, really drives the narrative in the book.
Thanks, Joel. Michelle or Amber Dawn or Billy Ray, do you want to speak to the core paradox in your book before we wrap up for the evening? No?
Sure, I will if no
Okay.
one's going to jump in there. The question is excellent, very articulate, and like, obviously a very active listener posed this question, and so yeah, I thank you for the question. I think the paradox in my book, at the core is, we are in a time that is celebrating what perhaps we might hashtag as diverse literatures. In creative writing programs, students are instructed to write what that's the foundation of so much of what we try to practice as writers. But we, as an arts sector, and as people that live in a colonial, violent, and very patriarchal sit-has nation, we haven't actually learned how to become dignified consumers of hashtag diverse literatures or trauma-informed literatures. So there's a disconnect between writers writing what they know, depending on their, experiential knowledge, and then being received into audiences or an arts sector that's all that's safe, and I do think there's so many literary professionals that are working on changing this, either on working on changing this within CanLit, or just being like, F you CanLit, and are creating art that's outside of sort of the dominant template that CanLit has laid down, including the nominees that are shortlisted for the Jim Deva Prize. So again, thanks everyone for doing the work to look at that and other paradoxes that we're currently discussing.
Thanks, Amber Dawn. That seems like kind of the perfect place to leave our Q&A for this event. So maybe I will thank all of our audience members who sent great questions. And thanks again, of course, to our 5 finalists, Joel Bakan, Billy Ray Belcourt, Amber Dawn, Michelle Good, and Benjamin Perrin. And thanks again to the Vancouver Writers Fest and the Vancouver Public Library for inviting the BC and Yukon Book Prizes to be part of Incite. And of course, I have to remind everyone that if you haven't yet checked out the titles shortlisted for the 2021 BC and Yukon Book Prizes, be sure to visit our website, bcyukonbookprizes.com. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you to all 5 of our authors. Certainly, this is not an easy time right now, and we all look to what the world is going to be like once COVID-19 is under control. It is a time when change is possible, and certainly books that provoke provide a framework for how things could be in a new world. And I think that's an interesting thing for us to be thinking about. And borrowing from what Joel said earlier, spring is still spring, and that's where the hope lies. So on that note, I'd like to thank you all very, very much for joining us. these books are all available in your favorite bookstores, so please do get out there and check them out, buy a copy, share them around. Thank you, and have a lovely evening. Be safe and stay healthy. Be well. Good night.